Madison Hart hadn't set foot on that stretch of land in over a decade. Not since the last family gathering before her father's health turned and her connection to that side of her lineage frayed like an old rope under strain. The property, a remote tract of woodland in northern Michigan with a slow-sloping descent toward a quiet lake, had been purchased by her grandfather in the 50s and passed down through hands that didn't always care for it the way it deserved. Madison had recently bought out her estranged stepsister's share in a process that was more transactional than emotional, conducted through curt emails and official signatures with no nostalgia or sentimentality exchanged. She didn't mind. For her, the land wasn't about family ties or sentimental echoes. It was about possibility, about space to breathe and build something enduring, something that answered to no one else's vision but her own. As a professional restoration ecologist, she had long dreamed of reclaiming neglected land and allowing it to become something vibrant again. Not a manicured garden, but a living, breathing biome that bore its own logic. This place, with its thickets of pine and fern-choked gullies, seemed like the perfect starting point. Arriving in early spring, when the ground was still damp from snowmelt and the trees just beginning to hint at green, she stepped out of her truck into silence so complete it pressed against her ears. No paved road led here, only a gravel path half overgrown with moss and interrupted by the erratic growth of saplings. She took it slow, eyes scanning the shifting silhouettes of the forest, recognizing some of the old stone markers her grandfather had placed decades ago. Small piles of glacial rock meant to indicate boundaries before any formal survey had been done. She'd planned to have proper mapping work done by June, but for now she relied on instinct and memory. The forest smelled the way she remembered it: wet soil, cold bark, the faint electric tang of lichen after rainfall, and yet something felt different, as though the trees themselves had leaned in during her absence, reshaping the silence. Half a mile in, as she navigated around a fallen trunk, her boot landed on something unexpected: a tamped-down trail of gravel, unnaturally smooth compared to the chaotic forest floor around it. The trail was new. She would have remembered it, and though it appeared somewhat discreet, it had clearly been used. Fresh tire tracks. The realization slowed her steps, not with fear, but with something quieter and more potent: doubt. She had owned this land for only 6 months, but no activity had been reported, and she had assumed, wrongly it seemed, that it lay dormant, untouched by others. As she followed the trail deeper into the woods, she began noticing subtle signs of human presence. A rope swing tied to a birch limb, freshly sawn branches cleared to make a path, the occasional cigarette butt lodged in mud, and then came the unmistakable smell of smoke, piney and sweet, not from wildfire but from a controlled campfire. That, and the sound of laughter. Rounding a bend and pushing past a curtain of young spruce, she saw them. 4 cabins, built from raw timber, raised on concrete blocks, each with a front porch and string lights looping from tree to tree like some curated glamping retreat. There were hammocks, metal fire pits, a wooden sign swinging from a chain that read, "Welcome to Wild Grove." She stood frozen, taking it in, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she believed she owned. A small group of people sat around a fire in folding chairs, mugs in hand, speaking in relaxed tones, oblivious to her presence. Just beyond them stood a man, mid-40s, sun-creased skin, button-down shirt half-tucked, calm as could be, who met her eyes with the ease of someone expecting her arrival. He smiled, unbothered, and raised his mug slightly in greeting, like she was the guest. That was the moment Madison knew something wasn't just wrong, but fundamentally off. Not only had someone built illegal structures on her land, they had done it with a kind of audacity that suggested they didn't think they needed permission. Or worse, believed they already had it. Madison stood rooted at the edge of the clearing, unsure whether to announce herself or retreat back into the forest. But the decision was made for her when the man near the fire gestured casually toward her as though she were an expected guest and called out with a voice both relaxed and unsettlingly confident. "You must be Madison," he said, not loudly but with such certainty that it carried through the space and silenced the murmured conversations of the others. She felt a jolt run through her spine at the sound of her own name spoken by a stranger on her own land. The others turned to look at her, not with alarm or guilt, but with the vague curiosity of travelers noticing someone new at a bus stop. It was the absence of shame that unsettled her most. She forced herself to step forward, crunching over pine needles, her words halting as she asked who he was and what exactly he thought he was doing here. The man introduced himself as Remy Holden, extending his hand as if they were neighbors meeting for the first time under perfectly ordinary circumstances. His palm was rough, his expression placid, his demeanor more like that of a host than a trespasser. He explained with a calmness that bordered on arrogance that he had been leasing this portion of land for over a year through an agreement with Jonathan Green, a name that rang no bells for Madison. He spoke with such ease that for a fleeting second she doubted her own knowledge of the property's chain of ownership. But there had never been a Jonathan Green in her family records, and certainly no one authorized to make leases. She told him bluntly that she was the sole legal owner of the property, and that there had never been any arrangement permitting the cabins or his activities. Remy didn't flinch. He sipped from his mug before replying that Jonathan was a local broker who had handled informal transfers for families not keen on managing rural acreage. He claimed to have receipts, contracts, even notarized statements, though when pressed, he did not produce any of them. Instead, he simply smiled and said that it was all in order, and that she needn't worry because nothing illegal was happening, that in fact he was doing her a favor by maintaining a piece of land that would otherwise rot unused. The words stung, not because they were true, but because they were delivered with the casual condescension of someone who had already decided where the moral high ground lay. She insisted that he and his companions leave immediately, but Remy merely gestured toward the cabins, where a small group of guests were emerging, stretching, smiling, carrying weekend bags. A van with the logo Cabin Spirit painted in faded teal letters idled at the edge of the clearing, its sliding door open, a cooler being unloaded by two young men in matching branded T-shirts. Madison watched in disbelief as money-exchanged hands and keys were given out. The cabins weren't just occasional squats. They were fully functioning rentals, part of an organized business marketed and operated without her knowledge or permission. She demanded again that they leave, her voice breaking with anger, but the only response she received was a soothing wave of the hand from Remy, as though she were overreacting. "We'll talk soon," he said evenly, "but right now I've got guests arriving. Maybe walk the lake. Clear your head. This is all more complicated than you think." Madison stormed back to her truck, her pulse hammering, her mind flipping between rage and disbelief. She sat gripping the steering wheel for several minutes before forcing herself to drive toward the county recorder's office, needing immediate confirmation that the property was still entirely in her name. The clerk on duty, an older woman with reading glasses perched low on her nose, tapped through the database and confirmed without hesitation that Madison was indeed the sole owner. No liens, no leases, no easements on file. The clarity should have been reassuring, but it only deepened the confusion. If the legal standing was so clean, then Remy's presence wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was deliberate, a fabrication designed to appear legitimate. By the time she returned to the site later that evening, the cabins glowed warmly in the dusk, laughter echoing across the water, smoke rising in tidy columns from the chimneys. The incongruity of it struck her with almost physical force. This wasn't some rough camp of opportunists or squatters. It was a curated experience, marketed and sold to paying customers, an operation bold enough to stake its claim in plain sight. She caught sight of one of the stone boundary markers her grandfather had built half a century ago, now half buried in moss, sitting directly behind the newest cabin's porch. There was no question in her mind. They were well within her land. As she watched from the shadows of the tree line, a family of 4 emerged from one of the cabins, the children carrying mason jars filled with candles. The sight pierced her with a strange dissonance. It looked almost wholesome, even picturesque, the kind of image that might appear on the cover of a lifestyle magazine about rustic getaways. But beneath that image lay theft, intrusion, the deliberate erasure of her ownership. She felt not just anger but an almost suffocating sense of violation, as though the soil itself were being pulled out from under her identity. Later that night, unable to sleep, she scoured the internet for Cabin Spirit and discovered a slick website advertising exclusive lakeside retreats on historic family land. The photos were clearly taken on her property, her grandfather's stone. Markers appearing in the backgrounds like silent witnesses. She clicked through booking calendars filled months in advance, glowing 5-star reviews praising the serenity and the attentive host Remy, who was commended for his knowledge of the local area. Some reviews even mentioned a land agreement that supposedly ensured guests were part of a community project to preserve the forest. Madison stared at the screen, her hands trembling. She had not just stumbled upon an encroachment. She had uncovered an entire manufactured narrative designed to overwrite her own, a story in which she had been erased, replaced by a stranger's fiction. When she finally shut her laptop and sat in the dark of her kitchen, she realized with a cold, sinking certainty that this was not a misunderstanding that could be cleared with a few stern words. Someone had built not just cabins, but a whole illusion of legitimacy around them, and the more she protested, the more she risked appearing like the intruder on her own land. For the first time, she felt the weight of how alone she truly was in this fight. The next week, Madison returned to the property with a representative from the county environmental office, a middle-aged inspector named David Kessler, who agreed to walk the boundaries with her and confirm whether any formal permits had been issued. For the cabins, she had rehearsed the confrontation in her head, imagining the shock on the inspector's face when he saw the structures rising out of her woods. But when they reached the familiar clearing, she found something different than before. A wide wooden gate, across the trail with a sign bolted into the frame, reading, Wild Grove Sanctuary. Private entry by code only. A padlocked chain held the gate closed, and laminated notices in bright ink warned against trespassing, listing a phone number for guest services. The cabins themselves were no longer just rustic huts scattered across a clearing. They had been dressed up in the trappings of legitimacy. Fresh gravel covered the ground, solar path lights traced neat lines between cabins, and a long wooden archway with hand-carved letters stood where her grandfather's stone marker once had been. It was as if her family's history had been overwritten with a carefully curated version that excluded her entirely. David Kessler examined the structures with detached curiosity, but offered little reaction. He admitted quietly that he had not seen any official filings for construction permits in this region, but when Madison pressed him to issue a violation, he grew uncomfortable, explaining that his office was not empowered to intervene without a formal complaint routed through the zoning commission. When she pointed to the cabins, incredulous, demanding to know what could possibly be more formal than this evidence before his eyes, he avoided her gaze and muttered that it was outside his scope, that there were overlapping jurisdictions and he could not take enforcement action personally. She realized with growing unease that the system she expected to protect her property was built on hesitations, gray areas, and bureaucratic handoffs, each authority eager to defer responsibility to another. Remy appeared while they stood by the gate, stepping out of the shadows as if summoned by their argument. He wore the same half-smile that made Madison's skin crawl, carrying a leather folder tucked under his arm. He greeted David warmly by name, and the familiarity between them suggested that this was not the first time they had met. Remy explained that everything was perfectly proper, that the cabins were managed under a conservation partnership, and that he would be happy to provide documentation showing the arrangement. When Madison demanded to see it, Remy opened his folder and withdrew a stack of photocopied letters bearing official seals. He held them just long enough for Madison to catch glimpses of signatures and dates before sliding them back into the folder, never actually handing them over. David, visibly relieved, accepted Remy's explanation at face value, promising Madison that the matter could be clarified at the county office but not making any effort to challenge what he had been shown. The betrayal hit Madison like a weight. She tried to interject, pointing out that none of these supposed agreements bore her name, that she had never signed or approved any of them, but Remy silenced her with a tone that was simultaneously soothing and threatening. He told her not to worry, that she would be taken care of, that in time she would see this arrangement was mutually beneficial. When she pressed him to explain what he meant, he leaned closer and said, almost conspiratorially, that land was wasted when it sat unused, that she could keep her title but allow his project to activate the woods. The word chilled her, as though her property were being transformed into something unrecognizable under a vocabulary she had never chosen. On the drive back into town, Madison found herself trembling, not from fear, but from the deeper unease of recognizing that she was up against more than a trespasser. This was not the act of an opportunist who had stumbled onto free land. This was orchestrated, layered with paper trails, partial truths, and enough show of legitimacy to confuse even officials. That night she searched through county records again, only to find a new filing dated just 3 weeks earlier, listing an entity called Wild Grove Preservation Collective as the manager of adjacent land with provisional access rights. The language was vague, but the effect was chilling. Someone had manufactured a parallel story in which her property was simply part of a larger patchwork project. The following weekend, Madison returned to the site alone, hoping to document the encroachment for herself. She found new details that unsettled her more deeply than before. Wooden posts with QR code stickers had been nailed into trees along the trail, offering check-in points for guests. A laminated map nailed to one cabin wall depicted not only the 4 existing cabins but additional planned units, trails, and even a wellness circle, marked directly over the hill where her father once set up a hunting blind. Each expansion was drawn as though inevitable, as though her claim to the soil no longer existed. She tore the map down, stuffing it into her jacket, but as she turned to leave, she caught sight of a laminated guest book hanging by the door. The entries were cheerful. Families describing their sanctuary weekend, couples celebrating anniversaries, and several referenced conversations with Remy about the original owners giving their blessing. Her blood ran cold. This was no longer just an illegal operation hidden in the woods. It was a story being rewritten in real time, guests persuaded that she had surrendered her rights and handed the land over willingly. Each glowing review, each social media post tagged with the Wild Grove name, etched her further out of her own property's identity. And Remy's quiet confidence suddenly made sense. He didn't need to fight her openly. He was constructing a narrative where she had never existed. Madison drove home with the map trembling in her hand, knowing with bleak certainty that the escalation had already begun. She had assumed her ownership papers were enough, but paper meant little against a structure designed to blur boundaries and drown out truth with repetition. The fight was no longer just about land, it was about reality itself, and the terrifying ease with which it could be stolen. Madison had always believed that ownership was a simple fact, something that existed in the sharp clarity of deeds and boundaries, but weeks of chasing shadows had begun to erode that certainty, and by the time she arranged a meeting with a local land surveyor named Daniel Price, she was desperate not for reassurance but for something solid she could cling to. Daniel was a quiet man in his 60s with a reputation for precision, the sort of person who carried decades of maps in his head and who remembered the region not as parcels and plots but as living history. She met him in his cramped office above a hardware store in town, where rolled charts lined the walls like scrolls in a monastery, and explained her situation with the intensity of someone recounting a dream that had taken on the texture of waking life. He listened without interruption, then disappeared into the back and returned with a box of old surveys. As he spread them out across the table, she felt an almost childlike relief, the sense that here, finally, was the anchor she had been searching for. The earliest maps showed her grandfather's purchase from the 50s, the boundaries traced in careful ink, the corners marked by stone piles that she had seen still standing in the woods. But then Daniel unfolded a more recent overlay from the past year, and Madison's stomach clenched. The section of forest where the cabins now stood had been shaded in a different color, marked with a notation, Conditional Conservation Overlay. She insisted this was impossible, that no such designation had ever been discussed with her, but Daniel explained that a provisional agreement had been filed in the county records, citing cooperative stewardship between private owners and a non-profit called the Wild Grove Preservation Collective. He admitted he had never heard of such an organization until now, and the phrasing struck him as deliberately vague, but what disturbed Madison most was the signature block, where her own name should have been. There appeared the words, Representative Authorization, M. Hart. The letters were crude imitations of her handwriting, enough to fool a clerk glancing quickly but instantly recognizable to her as a forgery. The discovery left her shaken, but Daniel pressed further, pulling out satellite imagery to confirm physical encroachments. The images showed the cabins appearing gradually over the last year, one by one, their roofs visible through the thinning canopy each spring. The timeline did not match Remy's story of an arrangement made only recently. This was not opportunism. It had been unfolding methodically, and by the time she had completed the purchase from her stepsister, the cabins were already being occupied. Madison's legal claim had been quietly undermined long before she ever stepped foot back on the land. Desperate for clarity, she contacted an attorney in the nearest city, a woman named Claire Donovan who specialized in property disputes. Claire reviewed the documents Madison brought, her deed, the surveys, the forged authorization, and her expression darkened with each page. She explained that while the forgery was blatant, the difficulty lay in how quickly false filings could entangle the legal process. If the county accepted the documents as valid, even temporarily, the burden fell on Madison to disprove them, and during that time the occupants could continue to operate. Worse still, Claire suspected that the Wild Grove Preservation Collective was not a genuine nonprofit, but a shell entity created to exploit loopholes in conservation law. "They don't need to win in court," Claire said grimly. "They only need to create enough confusion that you look like the aggressor when you try to reclaim what's yours." Madison left the office reeling, her mind circling the same sickening thought, that Remy and his people had anticipated every move, building a paper fortress around her land long before she had realized there was a battle to fight. And then, as if to confirm her dread, she returned to the property days later and discovered that the cabins had multiplied again. 2 new structures had appeared along the ridge, their frames already shingled, as if an invisible workforce had erected them overnight. Even more unsettling, she found a laminated flyer stapled to a tree at the entrance announcing upcoming forest renewal gatherings, where visitors were invited to join in morning circles and honor the original family's blessing of shared stewardship. Her name was not printed, but the implication was clear. She had been transformed in absentia into a symbolic figure granting approval. It was then that she stumbled upon the object that shifted her fear into something colder and sharper. Near one of the new cabins, half buried under pine needles, she found a guest's notebook, the kind distributed by wellness retreats. Most of the pages were filled with harmless affirmations and reflections, but one entry caught her eye. Dated only a week earlier, it described an evening gathering where Remy spoke about the lineage of the land and the responsibility carried forward after Margaret's passing. Margaret had been her grandmother, long dead, a name that no stranger, should casually invoke. The entry continued, mentioning how Remy had reassured guests that Madison understands this work and stands with us, even if she has not joined yet. The casual lie stole her breath. It was not just that they were erasing her. They were using her absence to speak in her voice. The realization forced her to confront the scale of what she faced. This was no longer simply a property dispute or an act of trespassing. It was a rewriting of reality, a campaign to replace her identity with a fabricated role in someone else's narrative. She thought back to the clerk at the recorder's office, to David Kessler's easy acceptance of Remy's folder, to the way even the children with their mason jar candles had looked as though they belonged more naturally in that space than she did. If enough people believed the story Remy told, if enough records reflected his version of events, then her truth might vanish, leaving her as nothing more than the intruder she had been made to seem. That night, sitting in her darkened kitchen with the guest notebook open in front of her, Madison felt the first edge of panic give way to a more dangerous determination. She understood that the fight was no longer about presenting evidence or appealing to the proper authorities. It was about piercing the illusion before it hardened into permanence. She thought of Daniel's maps, Claire's warnings, the forged signature, the laughter around the campfire, and the casual confidence in Remy's eyes when he told her she would be taken care of. They had built their narrative carefully, but it was not yet complete. She still had time, though the window was narrowing, and with every day she waited, the cabins grew more numerous, the guests more convinced, the lie more entrenched. She knew that the next step she took would decide whether she remained the rightful owner of her grandfather's woods or became a ghost in someone else's story. And for the first time she felt not fear, but a grim clarity. If they wanted to erase her, she would have to write herself back in with force they could not ignore. Madison returned to the woods a week later, her resolve stiffened by the evidence she had gathered. But what she found waiting for her unsettled her more deeply than the cabins themselves ever had. The dirt path that once led freely to the clearing was now flanked by wooden posts with laminated signs that bore the insignia of the Wild Grove Preservation Collective, as though it were a government agency rather than a fabrication. At first, she thought the signs were bluff, until she noticed the addition of small surveillance boxes mounted to the posts, blinking faintly in the evening light. Whether they were real cameras or props hardly mattered. The message was unmistakable. Her land had been transformed into a monitored zone, and every step she took toward her own property was now treated as trespass. She pushed past anyway, her boots sinking into the damp soil, determined to reach the ridge where the two new cabins had been rising. The sound of voices carried down the slope, not the laughter of carefree guests, but the more deliberate tones of instruction. Creeping closer, she saw Remy standing before a semicircle of visitors, gesturing expansively as if leading a seminar. His words floated to her through the branches. Talk of stewardship, resonance with ancestral soil, and continuity after Margaret. Hearing her grandmother's name again on his lips ignited a fury she could barely contain. Yet the audience listened with earnest attention, jotting notes in their journals, nodding along, accepting without hesitation a narrative in which her family's history had been repurposed as the foundation for his fiction. She waited until the group dispersed toward the cabins before approaching the site, but what she discovered made her stop short. A large canvas tent had been erected beside the newest structure, and inside were rows of folding chairs, a projector screen, and a table stacked with pamphlets. On the cover of each pamphlet was the phrase, "Wild Grove Retreats, Guided Renewal on Legacy Land." The text inside described upcoming programs, complete with pricing tiers, schedules, and a statement of partnership with the Hart family. Seeing her, name in print, twisted into a fabricated alliance, turned her anger into a cold dread. She stuffed one of the pamphlets into her bag and left before anyone noticed her, heart pounding with the knowledge that this was no longer a quiet trespass but a full commercial enterprise expanding under her nose. When she showed the pamphlet to Claire, the attorney, the reaction was immediate and grave. Claire explained that once such material circulated publicly, the narrative would be harder to challenge because it created reliance. Guests booking retreats, investors funneling money, local officials reluctant to disrupt what they saw as a community benefit. Madison's legal standing was still intact, but optics were shifting. "They're building legitimacy not with law, but with perception," Claire said. "If enough people believe the story, your ownership becomes irrelevant in practice." Madison left the office feeling as though she were sinking into quicksand, every new development dragging her deeper into a fight that seemed less about property and more about control of reality itself. The escalation soon moved from the cabins into her own daily life. Packages began arriving at her small house in town addressed to Wildgrove Administrative Partner Madison Hart, containing guest reservations, donation receipts, even printed testimonials thanking her for sharing her family's heritage. Someone was rerouting correspondence to her address, making it appear as though she were complicit. Worse still, a pair of disgruntled guests appeared at her doorstep one rainy evening, demanding a refund for a canceled retreat. When she tried to explain she had nothing to do with it, they accused her of lying and stormed off. She realized with a sick twist in her stomach that Remy's fiction was spilling beyond the forest into the fabric of her own identity. Determined to push back, she installed trail cameras of her own near the property lines, hoping to catch evidence of construction or unauthorized gatherings. Days later, when she retrieved the footage, she found images that made her skin crawl. Remy himself walking the boundary at dusk, not alone, but in the company of two men in dark jackets, both carrying clipboards. They paused at each stone marker, pointing, measuring, taking notes, and at one point one of the men produced a can of spray paint and marked a new line several yards inside her property. It was not random vandalism. It was an intentional redrawing of borders, the physical counterpart to the paperwork already filed in county records. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through her. She was watching the theft of her land happen inch by inch, boundary by boundary, and the evidence she collected felt both damning and yet powerless, because the people she might show it to had already proven their reluctance to intervene. The final blow of that week came when she returned to the ridge and found that the old hunting blind her father had built decades earlier, the one place that still carried the scent of his presence, had been dismantled. In its place stood a newly erected wooden platform with a sign that read, "Meditation Deck. Honor the past, release the future." She stood staring at it for a long time, tears stinging her eyes, not only from grief but from the realization that her personal history had been cannibalized into marketing material. What had once been a symbol of her father's life was now reduced to a stage set in someone else's story, a product to be consumed by strangers paying for the illusion of connection. Driving home that night, Madison gripped the steering wheel so tightly her hands ached, her mind reeling with the awareness that escalation was no longer subtle. They were dismantling not just her land, but her legacy, turning her silence into consent, her absence into participation. She knew then that waiting for the system to recognize her rights was a losing battle. If she did not act soon, with her own hands and her own voice, she would vanish from the narrative entirely, remembered only as the phantom name invoked to bless a lie. And for the first time she understood with terrifying clarity that the fight ahead would not be won in courtrooms or offices, but on the very soil where the cabins stood, because that soil was the only truth she had left. The morning of the hearing arrived with a low sky and the kind of heavy air that seemed to signal more than just rain. Madison drove to the county courthouse with the box of documents balanced on the passenger seat. Her deed, the forged filings bearing her name, the survey maps Daniel had dug out of storage, and the photographs from her trail cameras showing Remy and his men painting new lines across her boundary stones. She had not slept more than a few hours the night before, her mind replaying the words of Claire, who had warned her that even overwhelming evidence could be dulled by procedure, delays, or the simple unwillingness of officials to admit they had been. Duped. Yet, as she carried the box up the courthouse steps, she felt not fear, but a kind of bitter steadiness. The realization that this day was not about persuading strangers to believe her, but about refusing to let herself be erased. The courtroom itself was nearly empty, only a handful of observers scattered across the benches. On one side sat Remy with two associates, both in tailored jackets, their faces smoothed with the assurance of men who expected to win. They did not even look at her when she entered, as though she were already irrelevant. The judge, a woman with silver hair pulled back into a severe knot, called the case to order, and the proceedings began with Remy's attorney presenting a thick folder of documents, describing Wildgrove as a cooperative enterprise founded on conservation principles, claiming it had been in place for years with the tacit support of the Hart family. He spoke with polished ease, weaving together fragments of truth and invention until the narrative sounded almost plausible, and when he produced glossy pamphlets describing the retreats, complete with her family name printed in elegant script. The judge's eyes narrowed with the weight of apparent legitimacy. When Madison's turn came, she rose with shaking hands, though her voice was steadier than she expected. She laid out the timeline: the purchase from her stepsister, the clear chain of title, the absence of any agreements bearing her true signature. She held up the forged document for the court to see, pointing out the crude imitation of her handwriting, the mismatched dates, the notary stamp that belonged to an office in another state. Then she presented the photographs from her cameras, showing Remy's men redrawing boundaries, erasing her grandfather's markers, and painting new lines as though the land could be rewritten by spray paint. With each piece of evidence she placed on the table, she felt a little of her anger drain into focus, sharpening into something that resembled control. Remy finally rose to speak for himself, and it was then that the veneer of calm civility began to crack. He smiled as he addressed the judge, but his words carried an edge, insisting that Madison had abandoned the land for more than a decade, that communities had a right to reclaim what was neglected, that she was selfishly clinging to paper rights, while he and his guests were giving life to the forest. He spoke of stewardship, of circles and rituals, of Margaret Hart's supposed blessing, until the judge interrupted sharply to remind him that sentiment was not ownership. At that moment, Claire seized the opening, presenting the survey maps Daniel had provided, dated decades earlier, proving the cabin stood squarely within Madison's property lines. The tension broke when the judge leaned forward and asked Remy directly if he could produce a single document signed by Madison authorizing his enterprise. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before his attorney shuffled papers and offered a copy of the forged authorization. Madison felt her breath catch, waiting for the blow, but the judge examined it briefly, frowned, and then turned it toward Claire, who pointed out the irregularities in seal and handwriting. The silence that followed seemed to stretch, the weight of Remy's confidence collapsing in on itself. The ruling came swiftly after that. The court declared the Wildgrove filings invalid, the authorization fraudulent, the structures unauthorized. An injunction was issued ordering all cabins dismantled within 30 days, and the land restored to its original condition, with financial penalties to cover damages and legal fees. For the first time since this ordeal began, Madison felt the floor solid beneath her feet. She looked across the room at Remy, expecting anger, but what she saw instead was something far more unsettling. A thin smile that suggested retreat was not defeat, that his story would find another stage, another forest. Yet, for now at least, the land was hers again, carved back from the illusion with the weight of undeniable truth. As she stepped out of the courthouse into the thick air, rain beginning to fall in heavy drops, Madison did not feel triumph so much as exhaustion. The battle had been won, but she understood with a clarity that chilled her that some narratives never died. They simply waited for silence to return. The demolition of the cabins began 3 weeks later, carried out not by Madison herself but by a contracted crew hired under court order, their trucks grinding up the narrow path that had once been little more than a deer trail and now bore the scars of heavy use. She stood at the edge of the clearing as the first roof came down, the timber splintering under the weight of machinery, the glow of string lights and painted signs collapsing into heaps of discarded wood. For a moment, she felt almost disoriented, watching structures that had seemed so permanent vanish in a matter of hours, as though they had been illusions all along. Yet, when the last cabin fell and the smoke from controlled burning drifted through the pines, she sensed something shift inside her. Not relief exactly, but the slow unwinding of a knot that had tightened for months. The county sent surveyors to re-establish the markers, and one by one the old stones her grandfather had placed were uncovered from moss and dirt, reset in the earth with official stakes beside them. Seeing them restored filled her with a strange tenderness, as though the land itself were being allowed to breathe again after suffocating under someone else's story. Neighbors who had kept their distance before now approached her with quiet words of support, some admitting they had believed Wildgrove's version of events, others confessing they had avoided involvement out of fear or apathy. Madison did not hold it against them. She understood now how easily perception bent when spoken with enough confidence. In the weeks that followed, she walked the property each morning, the silence returning little by little, no longer broken by strangers' voices or the hum of generators. The meditation platform where her father's blind had once stood was gone, and she sat for a long time on the bare ridge, breathing in the cool air, telling herself that what remained was not absence, but possibility. She began drafting plans to restore the forest, not to erase what had happened, but to root herself more firmly into the soil, to make it harder for anyone else to overwrite her place in its history. Remy disappeared from town not long after the injunction, leaving behind only rumors of other ventures in other counties, but Madison did not waste thought on him anymore. His story had collapsed here, and that was enough. What mattered was that her own had endured, not in pamphlets or websites, but in the quiet persistence of the land itself, which had outlasted intrusion before and would do so again. Standing at the water's edge one evening, the lake still and the trees reflected in its surface, she understood that victory was not loud and would never feel absolute. It was simply this: the right to stand on her own ground, uninvited voices silenced, and know that she had not disappeared.